They found her in 1922 while clearing a forgotten antechamber beside a collapsed section of the royal apartments in Amarna. And the moment the first beam of light touched her preserved face, every archaeologist present froze in a silence so heavy it felt like the air itself refused to move, because her expression, twisted in a blend of terror, shame, and something far more complicated, told a story far darker than any written chronicle had dared to preserve. Her jaw seemed clenched as if she had died mid-cry. Her fingernails had carved desperate crescent marks into the cedar floor beneath her, and the faint traces of gold dust scattered across her cheeks suggested she had been prepared for a ceremonial night she had not wanted to enter. A night in which she was meant to stand before the living God who ruled Egypt not as his sister, but as his bride. A ritual so meticulously engineered that even her refusal would have been interpreted as cosmic treason. The sealed chamber still smelled of resin, sweat, and incense when they opened it, and the walls carried fragments of hymns describing a union meant to restore divine order, even if it shattered a human soul in the process. This is what the pharaohs tried to hide, until now. In the winter of 1351 BCE, during the final years of Egypt's 18th dynasty, a young princess named Sitamon entered the royal residence in Thebes for what should have been a routine preparation ceremony. Yet every account that references her, whether scratched onto ostraca or hinted at in damaged papyri, describes a tension in her movements that day, as if she already understood the invisible thread tightening around her life, pulling her toward a throne she did not want and a role she could not refuse, all because of the blood that ran through her veins. She was only 14 when the court priests began whispering her name in proximity to the next great ritual of dynastic renewal, and every whisper carried the same implication, that her lineage made her too valuable to marry outside the royal house, that the gods demanded she remain pure, that the dynasty required her to stand beside her brother instead of any other man in Egypt, and that her future had already been bartered away long before she had learned to speak the language of statecraft. Her first mistake, if it could even be called a mistake, came the moment she allowed herself to believe that the rules did not apply to her, that the ancient decrees carved during the reigns of earlier pharaohs were mere traditions rather than binding laws, and that her refusal would matter more than the political machinery that had already decided the trajectory of her life. The Egyptians named the practice Senet Nesu, the divine kinship bond, and while the priesthood justified it through elaborate theology about gods marrying their sisters to preserve cosmic order, the reality for the human beings caught inside these rituals was far uglier, because it meant that personal desire, emotional safety, and simple human dignity could be overridden instantly by the demands of the throne. When fragments of the household decrees of Akhenaten surfaced centuries later, scholars realized how rigid the system truly was, because the text made it painfully clear that princesses of the royal line were essentially state property, to be assigned according to the will of the pharaoh and the interpretations of the priesthood, leaving young women like Sitamon with no path of escape, no alternate destiny, and no voice capable of altering their fate. What happened next was documented by a palace scribe whose scroll remained hidden for nearly 3,000 years. When scholars first unrolled the fragmented scroll attributed to Pentu, a palace scribe active during the reign of Amenhotep III, they discovered that his handwriting shifted dramatically across the parchment, beginning with steady, deliberate strokes and slowly collapsing into lines that slanted like the handwriting of a man whose breath faltered with every word he recorded. And archaeologists immediately understood why. Because Pentu had written not for the archives of the living, but for the conscience of the dead, leaving behind an account that no priest would have allowed to survive if they had known it existed. The scroll opened with a chilling description of the royal apartments on the night of Sitamon's initiation, describing corridors heavy with incense, walls covered with hymns celebrating the union of divine siblings, and attendants moving with rigid precision as if performing actions rehearsed countless times. Yet Pentu wrote these details not with pride but with dread, marking the first indication that someone inside the palace understood the human cost of the rituals they carried out. The line that struck researchers hardest came midway through the opening passage, written so faintly that it had to be enhanced using spectral imaging, and when they finally deciphered it, the room reportedly fell silent because Pentu had written, "I write because silence kills the innocent and binds the guilty, and I fear the gods will judge me more for my obedience than for my honesty." The simple weight of that confession reshaped everything historians thought they knew about royal sibling marriages, proving that not everyone inside the palace believed these unions were sacred or divinely sanctioned. Some saw them for what they were: coercive, destructive, and engineered entirely to preserve royal bloodlines at the cost of individual lives. But that wasn't the worst part, because the scroll soon shifted from setting the scene to describing the physical environment in which the ritual unfolded, an environment so meticulously constructed that it left no space for doubt, hesitation, or escape. Pentu described the ritual chamber as a windowless room carved into the sandstone foundations of the palace, designed specifically to isolate participants from the outside world, with walls polished to such a degree that the surface reflected distorted silhouettes in the flickering lamplight, creating a haunting sense that unseen figures watched from every direction. The chamber's only door was reinforced with bronze and sealed from the outside, a design choice Pentu said was justified by priests who believed that divine unions require earthly boundaries. Yet anyone reading his account can sense the deeper truth. The door existed not for religious symbolism, but for containment, ensuring that once the chosen sister entered the room, she would not leave until the ritual was completed, regardless of her state of mind or willingness to participate. Pentu described the air as heavy with a mixture of myrrh, lotus resin, and something else he could not identify. A scent he said clung to his nostrils long after he left the chamber, suggesting that the environment was intentionally crafted to heighten vulnerability and suppress resistance. The scroll then offered the first truly disturbing detail, one that modern historians still debate, because Pentu wrote that before a princess entered the ritual chamber, she underwent a preparation rite inside the Hecat room, a narrow alcove lined with shelves of ritual oils and divine icons. According to Pentu, the attendants whispered prayers over her as they applied the sacred mixture to her skin, prayers invoking the goddess Hathor as the mother, the sister, the bride, effectively collapsing multiple roles into one suffocating identity. He noted that many young women trembled during this preparation, and that some fainted, a fact he attributed not to physical weakness, but to the overwhelming psychological burden of what was expected of them. He then added a single line that continues to unsettle scholars. Their eyes were not the eyes of mortals, but of birds trapped beneath a predator's shadow. But even that chilling imagery was not the revelation that ultimately shocked modern researchers, because the scroll went on to describe a moment Pentu claimed to have witnessed directly, a moment he said marked the point at which his loyalty to the crown fractured irreparably. He wrote of a night when a princess, who scholars now believe was Cinnamon, hesitated before entering the chamber and whispered to him that she wished to flee, to disappear into the desert, to abandon the palace entirely, and Pentu confessed that for a single breath he considered helping her escape. However, before he could respond, the chief priest appeared, placing a hand on her shoulder and reciting a passage from the Book of Kingship, reminding her that refusal was equivalent to defying Ma'at, the divine order, and that a princess who broke Ma'at risked plunging the entire kingdom into chaos. This moment, Pentu wrote, was when the chamber's purpose became clear to him. It was not a sanctuary of divine union, but a cage constructed by power, tradition, and fear. Then came what researchers call the Amarna interruption, a section of the scroll in which Pentu described a ritual that went catastrophically wrong, though several portions of the account are damaged beyond restoration. What remains legible reveals that during one ritual, the princess collapsed unexpectedly, possibly due to the heavy incense or overwhelming stress, and attendants panicked because the ceremony could not be postponed without risking cosmic disorder, according to priestly doctrine. Pentu wrote that the priests ordered the ritual to continue despite her condition, and that the attendants carried her limp body into the chamber while chanting the hymns mechanically, their faces pale, their voices trembling, revealing that even those trained for this role were not immune to the horror of what they were doing. The scroll abruptly shifted to the aftermath, describing attendants emerging from the chamber, pale and shaken, washing their hands repeatedly as if trying to remove something invisible. Pentu noted that one of the attendants, a young man named Hui, refused to sleep for several nights afterward, muttering incoherently about eyes watching from the walls and voices that do not sound like voices, suggesting that the psychological toll extended beyond the princesses to those forced to facilitate the rituals. Hui eventually disappeared from the palace records, and Pentu hinted that the priesthood might have reassigned him to a distant temple to silence his unrest, though no definitive evidence survives. But that wasn't the worst part, because Pentu's scroll contained one final section, far more haunting than the rest. This final passage described the discovery of a small wooden box hidden behind a stack of ritual tablets in the scribe's storage room, a box Pentu claimed belonged to one of the princesses and contained a piece of linen covered in ink. The writing on the linen was faint but legible, and when modern scholars translated it, they found a heartbreaking message: "I am not a goddess. I am a daughter of Egypt, and Egypt devours its daughters." Pentu wrote that he wept upon reading it and considered bringing it to the pharaoh directly, but fear stopped him, fear that he would be punished for questioning divine law, fear that the priests would destroy both the message and the messenger, fear that truth had no place in a world built on ritual and silence. When Pentu's scroll ends, it does so abruptly, with half a sentence trailing off into torn fibers, and modern researchers often remark on how it feels less like the conclusion of a document and more like the sudden silence of a man who realized he had already written too much. The last preserved line reads, "I pray that someone in the future will see what we cannot speak." After that, there is nothing, not another stroke of ink, not another breath of testimony. Pentu never wrote again. To understand how deeply the royal machinery enforced the so-called divine unions between pharaohs and their sisters, historians turn not to mythic explanations or gilded inscriptions that praise the king's lineage, but to the bureaucratic records preserved in fragments across Thebes and Memphis, because those records, cold, administrative, and stripped of poetic embellishment, reveal a system so comprehensive that escape was not merely difficult but unthinkable for the young women entangled within it. The practice, known to the priesthood as Senet Nesu Netere, the holy sibling bond, was framed as a cosmic obligation rooted in the myth of Isis and Osiris, yet beneath that religious veneer existed an unyielding political logic. If the pharaoh married outside the royal bloodline, noble families gained influence. Therefore, the safest way to secure the throne was to turn his sisters into instruments of dynastic stability, regardless of their desires, fears, or personal destinies. The machinery that supported this system spanned three institutions: the priesthood, the court administrators, and the royal tutors, each playing a distinct role to ensure that princesses were prepared, shaped, and ultimately resigned to their fate, long before the ritual chamber sealed its bronze door behind them. The process began in childhood, when royal daughters were assigned a special educator known as the Keeper of Purity, a title that sounds gentle but masked, a rigid program designed to separate the girl emotionally from ordinary society. She learned songs describing the cosmic union of divine siblings, stories praising queens who married their brothers as embodiments of Ma'at, and daily recitations reinforcing that her existence served the throne above all else. A surviving tablet from the reign of Thutmose IV states, "The daughter of the sun is born for the sun's return," a phrase scholars believe was repeated often to ensure that no princess imagined a life beyond the palace. As the girl aged into adolescence, the preparation intensified. Her attendants monitored her movements, controlled her reading material, and regulated every social interaction, instilling the belief that her eventual selection was not a choice but a destiny predestined by the gods themselves. It was a psychological reshaping rather than a religious education, and its purpose was not enlightenment but compliance. The next stage of the system involved the priesthood, who performed elaborate evaluations to determine which princess would become the great royal wife, a title that sounded honorable but carried a burden few wished to bear. They examined omens, traced lineage charts, and performed rituals meant to reveal divine favor. Yet beneath these mystical procedures lurked calculations of political convenience. The chosen sister was often the one whose marriage would best reinforce the pharaoh's authority, stabilize succession, or prevent rival factions from gaining influence through external unions. The priests justified their decisions with theological explanations that framed resistance as sacrilege, claiming that a princess who refused her role jeopardized the harmony of the universe, a claim used so effectively that by the time the girl reached the selection age, often between 12 and 14, her sense of duty had been shaped into something so heavy she often struggled to breathe beneath it. The most haunting example of this suffocating system is the story of Princess Nebeta, daughter of Amenhotep III and sister of the future Akhenaten. At 15, Nebeta was brought before the priestly council in a ceremony known as the Weighing of Destiny, an event conducted inside the Temple of Luxor, where her lineage was recited aloud while incense filled the air with a haze so thick that she could barely see the elders standing before her. Her attendance later recorded in a private memoir, preserved on 2 limestone fragments discovered in 1908, that Nebeta trembled uncontrollably throughout the ceremony, and one of them, a servant woman named Rainifer, wrote, "She clutched my hand as if drowning, yet no one reached to rescue her, for destiny was declared and mercy forbidden." The priests concluded that Nebeta's bloodline made her the ideal candidate for the great royal wife, and her fate was sealed without her speaking a single word in the matter. Once selected, the princess entered the stage of ritual conditioning overseen by the Hamnetcher, the high servants of the god king. They taught her the hymns she was expected to recite during the union ceremony, instructed her in the gestures symbolizing acceptance of her cosmic role, and drilled her in the postures of offering, movements meant to convey submission to the divine order. The training took place inside a chamber called the Pernesut, or House of the King's Essence, a long hall decorated with scenes of gods and goddesses engaging in sacred unions, imagery meant to reinforce that her personal fears were irrelevant compared to the mythic narrative she was now trapped within. Survivors' accounts are non-existent, as no princess dared oppose the priesthood openly, but the writings of court attendants reveal glimpses of the emotional violence embedded in the process. One text describes a princess who repeatedly bit her lip until it bled during training. Another records a girl who stared at the floor throughout the sessions, refusing to meet anyone's eyes, as if the weight of what awaited her made the world itself too difficult to look at. The most chilling justification for this system comes from the writings of High Priest Menkaper, whose stone inscription found in Karnak reads, "The throne is a sun that burns away impurity, and only those born from its flame may sit beside it." In other words, the priests believed, or claimed to believe, that only a woman who shared the king's blood could reinforce his legitimacy, ensuring that their divine authority remained unchallenged. This belief granted them immense power, allowing them to override any personal objections and suppress dissent by invoking divine necessity. No one dared challenge the system openly, because doing so meant challenging the stability of the kingdom itself, and in ancient Egypt nothing was feared more than chaos, the eternal enemy of Ma'at. The cultural weight of this fear ensured compliance even among those who despised the system, binding the court into silent complicity. Yet amidst this collective submission, there were rare voices of dissent, individuals who dared to question the morality of the rituals despite the risks. One such figure was the court official Horemheb, not to be confused with the later pharaoh of the same name, whose surviving letter to a fellow administrator contains veiled criticisms of the system. In the fragmentary papyrus discovered near the village of El Lisht in 1974, Horemheb wrote, "The daughters of the palace walk with shadows upon their hearts, yet the priests call those shadows divine." Scholars believe this was a subtle critique of the sibling marriage ritual, especially since Horemheb later lost his position abruptly, with palace records noting only that he was removed for failure of devotion. Some historians suspect he was exiled or executed discreetly, a fate that served as a warning to anyone else who might challenge the institution. His disappearance highlighted the system's ruthlessness. Dissent was not debated or tolerated, but silenced swiftly to preserve the illusion of divine order. Statistics derived from tomb inscriptions and genealogical records indicate that at least 11 pharaohs across the 18th and 19th dynasties married one or more of their sisters, and modern analysis suggests that more than 20 royal women were compelled into these roles over a span of roughly 3 centuries. Each marriage sustained the political order but fractured the lives of the individuals involved, creating a cycle in which personal suffering was transformed into statecraft. The rarity of preserved personal writings from these women is not due to accident, it reflects deliberate erasure. The priesthood had no interest in preserving records that might reveal doubt, fear, or resistance, and the royal scribes focused exclusively on producing texts that praised the king's virtues and celebrated the union as a cosmic necessity. The humanity of the princesses vanished beneath layers of ceremonial language, their voices drowned by the machinery that turned them into symbols rather than people. Further evidence of the psychological toll emerges from the burial of Princess Meritaten, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Although Meritaten is more famous for other reasons, A lesser-known discovery occurred in 2003, when archaeologists excavated a subsidiary chamber within the northern cemetery of Amarna and found a series of clay figurines depicting a woman kneeling with her hands clenched tightly against her chest, her head bowed in a posture of distress. Near the figurines was a single ostracon inscribed with the words, "She carries the burden of heaven, though heaven does not ease her." The similarity between the stylized features on the figurines and contemporary depictions of Meritaten led some scholars to believe that these objects reflected her inner turmoil, possibly created by an attendant who witnessed her suffering during the ritual conditioning process. The figurines served not as official propaganda, but as emotional testimony preserved in clay. Let me tell you about one victim whose story rarely appears in mainstream histories, because her name survived only in a damaged lineage list carved on a shattered limestone block. Princess Henetaneb, daughter of Ramses II, who lived during a period of intense expansion and political ambition. According to a surviving temple inscription, Henetaneb was designated as one of the chosen of the throne, a title given to royal daughters deemed suitable for ritual union with their brothers. Archaeologists believe she resisted the selection, as her name appears abruptly in a list of royal women who returned to the house of the mothers, a phrase that often signified confinement within a secluded wing of the palace. The abrupt disappearance of her name from subsequent records suggests she may have been isolated for refusing the ritual, a fate arguably worse than the ritual itself, as confined princesses often suffered from malnutrition, depression, and an overwhelming sense of abandonment. The question that haunts scholars today is simple. Why did no one stop this? Why did no court official, no priest, no royal tutor intervene on behalf of the young women trapped within the system? The answer lies in the overwhelming cultural force of Ma'at, the belief that cosmic order depended entirely on the stability of the throne, and any disruption of royal lineage, whether through external marriage or refusal of obligation, risked plunging the kingdom into disorder. The fear of chaos was so deeply ingrained that even those who recognized the cruelty of the system felt unable to oppose it. The royal household functioned like a universe within a universe, governed by rituals so ancient they felt immovable, and any attempt to challenge them would have been seen not as an act of compassion but as an act of sacrilege. The priests wielded this fear masterfully, using it to suppress dissent and preserve their own power. The ultimate brutality of the system lay not in a single act or ritual, but in the way it consumed entire lives, bending the identities of royal daughters until they became reflections of myths rather than individuals, and compelling them to uphold a tradition that offered them reverence in public but silence in private. Their suffering was invisible to the world because the institutions around them ensured that their voices never reached beyond the palace walls. The system survived for centuries because it was designed to be indestructible, supported by religion, reinforced by politics, and maintained through fear. It was a machine that devoured daughters in the name of divine order, leaving behind fragments of their pains scattered across tomb walls, broken tablets, and the desperate words of those few who dared to write the truth. When historians finally pieced together the genealogical data, burial records, temple inscriptions, and dynastic lists spanning the 18th through the 20th dynasties, the scale of the practice came into grim focus. Because it became clear that the ritual unions were not isolated occurrences, limited to one unusually zealous pharaoh or one religiously radical priestly faction, but rather a deeply entrenched system that slowly consumed the lives of countless royal daughters over nearly 300 years. Scholars estimate that between 25 and 35 princesses were compelled into these dynastic marriages across this long period, though the true number may be higher, since many names were erased, altered, or absorbed into ceremonial titles that obscured their individual identities. The cruelty of the system lay not only in the rituals themselves, but in the way the kingdom converted these young women into living symbols, stripping them of personal destinies and binding them into the machinery of statecraft in a manner that left long trails of psychological ruin, emotional suffocation, and generational silence across the royal record. The aftermath for the women who survived the initial ritual varied, but none of the outcomes could be described as freedom or healing, because the roles assigned to them were designed to maintain appearances, not to repair the deep fractures inflicted by the institution. Some princesses became ceremonial queens, spending their days in gilded isolation within the palace, moving through rooms decorated with scenes celebrating the very rituals that had devastated them, forced to embody symbols of fertility, stability, and divine presence while carrying memories of fear, coercion, and helplessness that could not be spoken aloud. Others fell into what palace records euphemistically labeled withdrawal, disappearing from public life entirely and living out their days in secluded quarters where attendants reported long periods of silence, insomnia, and erratic behavior that modern scholars recognize as symptoms of trauma. A few ended up in remote temple residences under the supervision of priestesses, where their psychological unraveling was reframed as spiritual devotion, effectively transforming their suffering into a religious narrative that conveniently concealed the damage inflicted by the system. History buried the truth not through a single act of censorship, but through a slow, deliberate process conducted by generations of scribes, priests, and royal propagandists who understood that the stability of the throne depended on the perfection of its mythology, a mythology that could not survive the existence of frightened, unwilling queens whose bodies and identities had been used to preserve the dynasty. The royal scribes wrote only what reinforced the divine legitimacy of the pharaoh. The priesthood maintained liturgies that praised the ritual unions as sacred acts necessary for cosmic harmony, and later Greek and Roman historians focused on the spectacle of Egypt rather than the hidden emotional world of the palace women. By the time early Christian chroniclers summarized the era, they reframed the rituals as decadent exaggerations of pagan excess, stripping away the political structure that enabled them and recasting the practice as moral decay rather than systemic coercion. As centuries passed, the individual voices of the princesses faded into silence because every institution around them had an incentive to keep their experiences unrecorded, unseen, and unremembered. What ultimately shattered this silence were modern excavations conducted in the early 2000s at Amarna, Luxor, and Memphis, where archaeologists uncovered evidence that aligned disturbingly with the whispered fragments left behind in ancient records. In 2005, researchers excavating a collapsed storage chamber beneath the northern palace in Amarna discovered several boxes containing personal belongings of royal women, including combs, amulets, and small clay figurines with tightly clasped hands and bowed heads, objects that had no official ceremonial purpose and instead resembled private devotional pieces created by women trapped in roles they could not escape. One of the most striking finds came in 2008, when a team led by Dr. Nefertari Salim uncovered a series of linen strips inside a sealed limestone vessel, each strip containing short hieratic inscriptions that scholars believe reflect individual messages written by palace women during the preparation rituals. Many fragments were incomplete, damaged by time and insects, but a few lines survived with haunting clarity, revealing emotions the official records never acknowledged. The most devastating discovery occurred in 2016 during a re-excavation of a burial chamber connected to the tomb of a minor princess in Thebes, where archaeologists found a wooden panel tucked behind a collapsed section of plaster. The panel bore a faint inscription written in a trembling hand, clearly not the work of a trained scribe, and spectral imaging revealed a message whose raw humanity broke through 3 millennia of concealment. The inscription read, Nebsu Pether Irit, Akem Sekhem Set Aat. Researchers translated it as, Heaven sees what is done, even in the strongest chambers. This message, written by a royal woman whose name did not survive on any official document, offered a rare and heartbreaking glimpse into the inner world of the victims, suggesting that even within the suffocating confines of ritual duty, their awareness of injustice remained painfully sharp. The cumulative weight of these findings forced historians to reevaluate the traditional narrative of Egypt's royal sibling marriages, shifting the focus from theological symbolism and political strategy to the human cost borne by the women whose lives were consumed by the institution. The evidence made clear that the system did not simply use ritual language to justify political necessity, but actively manipulated identity, emotional autonomy, and personal freedom, creating a lineage of queens whose suffering became the invisible foundation of Egyptian kingship. Every artifact, every inscription, every clay figurine stands as a silent witness to lives reshaped, diminished, or broken by rituals designed to preserve cosmic order while sacrificing human dignity. What emerges from these discoveries is not a story of divine unions or sacred bonds, but a chronicle of young women trapped between myth and monarchy, forced to uphold a system that demanded their compliance while denying their humanity. The haunting message from the Theban panel echoes across centuries, carrying the weight of all the voices that were silenced. Neb Supet her Irat. Heaven sees what is done. When we return to the image of that princess discovered in the sealed antechamber of Amarna, her face frozen in an expression that seemed to contain terror, resignation, and an unspoken plea preserved across 33 centuries, it becomes impossible to separate the individual tragedy from the vast machinery that consumed her. Because her story was not an isolated aberration, but a single thread woven into a tapestry of suffering hidden beneath gold masks, divine titles, and monumental architecture that proclaimed perfection while concealing the human fractures beneath. The rituals that reshaped her life and claimed the lives of so many others were not simply ancient customs misunderstood through the lens of modern morality. They were deliberate mechanisms crafted to preserve power at the expense of those born into roles they could not challenge, bound by a religious worldview that made obedience synonymous with cosmic order and resistance indistinguishable from treason against the universe itself. This is what the pharaohs tried to hide, not through violent suppression alone, but through centuries of careful inscription, selective memory, and the elevation of myth over truth, ensuring that the voices of their daughters dissolved into ceremonial silence. When an empire decides that some people are not people but symbols, when it transforms daughters into vessels for political stability and disguises coercion beneath the language of the divine, the cost is measured not only in broken lives but in the distortions of history itself, because every inscription praising cosmic harmony stands atop a buried story of fear, erasure, and endurance. Yet every time archaeologists unearth a panel etched with trembling handwriting or recover a simple clay figurine carved by hands that were never meant to leave a record, the narrative shifts back toward the truth, restoring fragments of humanity to the women whose suffering was once considered an acceptable price for dynastic continuity. Every skeleton we find, every inscription we uncover, every whispered line preserved on linen or limestone brings us closer to voices that were never meant to be heard, reminding us that even the strongest chambers cannot conceal everything forever. Neb Supet her Irat. Heaven sees what is done. This is the story historians tried to bury. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever.